The Veil was a ghost's graveyard, a celestial tomb where dead stars had bled their light into swirling clouds of incandescent dust and hydrogen. For the ships that called this nebula home, navigation wasn't about following charts, but about reading the tides of radiation and surfing the bow waves of gravitational anomalies. Kalen Vance knew these tides better than any man alive. His ship, the Ghost, was as much a product of the Veil as he was a patchwork of salvaged alloys and jury-rigged systems, ugly and resilient, its hull scarred with the silent stories of 100 desperate escapes. They were on the Outer Rim, a place where the Veil's colorful mists thinned into the stark, unforgiving black of the Consortium's space, hunting for ghosts of a different kind derelict probes. Forgotten survey drones, anything the ancient galactic power had discarded and left to rot. It was a scavenger's life, but it was their life, free from the suffocating order that governed the rest of the galaxy. The latest catch was a Consortium deep space relay, a lattice of crystalline structures that hummed with a faint, dying energy. As his crew, a tight-knit family of outcasts and wanderers, carefully sliced it apart for precious components. Kalen monitored the sensor feeds from the cockpit. That's when he saw it. A flicker, not a ship, not an energy surge he recognized, but a wave of absolute nothingness propagating from deep Consortium territory. It was a ripple of perfect silence moving through the background radiation of the cosmos, erasing the noise of existence as it passed. On the relay's damaged data core, he found a fragment, a single, terrifying line of code buried under layers of routine diagnostics. Stasis Field Protocol, Phase 1 Boundary Finalization. He didn't know what it meant, but a cold dread, as pervasive as the Veil's dust, settled deep in his bones. This wasn't a weapon, it was an erasure. He brought the fragment and his sensor logs to Bastion, humanity's capital and only real fortress, a hollowed-out asteroid teeming with 1 million souls, nestled in the densest part of the Veil. In the sterile, polished halls of the Terran Defense Fleet Command, his warnings were met with a placid, bureaucratic skepticism. The admirals, men and women who thought of war in terms of fleet engagements and kinetic strikes, saw only sensor ghosts and a scavenger's wild theories. Subcommander Eva Rostova, a young officer whose ambition burned as brightly as the plasma conduits in her polished uniform, was tasked with officially debriefing and dismissing him. She listened with a practiced patience, her face a mask of professional courtesy, but Kalen saw the flicker of unease in her eyes as she looked at the data. "Your report is noted, Captain Vance," she had said, the words a clean, sterile dismissal. "We have no other intelligence to corroborate this. Silent apocalypse. The Consortium has ignored us for a century. They have no reason to act now." But the way she held the data slate, her knuckles white, told him she didn't believe her own words. Cast out from the halls of power, Kalen knew there was only one person who might understand the chilling implication of what he'd found. He descended into the lower levels of Bastion, into the cacophony of the underhabs, where the air was thick with the smells of recycled water and fried protein. There, in a laboratory that looked more like a technological hoarder's nest, he found Dr. Eris Thorne. The xenophysicist was a man haunted by his own genius, exiled from the scientific community for his radical, almost heretical theories about the Consortium's mastery over space-time. Thorne's eyes, wide and manic, lit up with a terrifying clarity as he analyzed the data. He paced his cluttered lab, muttering about chronoton particles and temporal mechanics, his hand sketching impossible equations onto a transparent screen. "They're not coming to fight us," Thorn whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of horror and vindication. "They wouldn't dirty their hands. This is sanitation, cosmic sanitation." He explained his theory, a weapon that didn't destroy matter but froze it, locking a region of space in a single, eternal moment, and a cage made of time itself. As the weight of his words settled, a siren blared through the station, a jarring, panicked shriek that cut through the Hab's normal din. A priority alert flashed across Thorn's screen. "Outpost Epsilon 7 has gone silent." Epsilon 7 was humanity's furthest listening post, a tiny sensor buoy on the absolute edge of the Veil. It hadn't sent a distress signal. It hadn't been reported destroyed. It had simply stopped. Eva Rostova found Kalen in Thorn's lab an hour later. The professional mask was gone, replaced by a grim resolve. The admirals were still debating, forming committees, demanding more data. They were moving at the speed of bureaucracy while an apocalypse crept toward them at the speed of light. "You were right," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "The official channels are useless. I need your ship. Captain, I need your knowledge of the Veil." Kalen looked from the determined officer to the haunted scientist. An unlikely alliance, born of impending doom. He needed her access to military-grade sensor pods and her authority to requisition them. She needed his ship, the Ghost, the only vessel in the fleet that could dance through the Veil's hazards without broadcasting its presence to the entire sector. "And he's coming with us," Kalen said, nodding toward Thorn, who was already packing sensitive instruments into a shock-proof case. Rostova hesitated, her military training screaming against bringing a civilian, an unstable one at that, into a potential conflict zone. But one look at the sheer, terrifying certainty in Thorn's eyes told her that his knowledge was as vital as any weapon. The journey back to the edge was a tense, silent affair. The Ghost slipped through the nebula's glowing tendrils, its patched-up systems running unnervingly quiet. They were heading toward the last known coordinates of Epsilon 7, flying into the teeth of the unknown. As they neared the coordinates, the ship began to feel wrong. The hum of the engine seemed to stretch. The light from the consoles felt thick, and a strange, low-frequency vibration resonated through the deck plates. "We're close," Thorn breathed, his eyes glued to a custom-built sensor array. "The field is affecting local space-time." And then they saw it. It wasn't a wall of energy or a shimmering barrier. It was a line of perfect stillness against the chaotic swirl of the nebula. On one side, cosmic dust danced and swirled in its eternal ballet. On the other, every mote of dust, every wisp of gas, was frozen, a perfect snapshot of a single moment. It was the edge of forever. Kalen launched a probe, a small, remote drone, guiding it toward the silent curtain. Rostova watched the telemetry, her face pale in the glow of the screen. Thorn simply stared, his expression one of awe and utter horror. The drone passed the boundary without a sound, without a flash. Its video feed froze instantly on a single static image of the frozen dust cloud ahead. Its transponder went silent. But Kalen's long-range material sensors confirmed the impossible. The drone was still there, physically intact, every molecule in place, just locked in time. "My God," Rostova whispered. "It's real." They were watching the birth of their own tomb, a silent, creeping death that would swallow their homes, their worlds, their entire civilization, leaving them as nothing more than a static exhibit in a galactic museum. Suddenly, the space in front of them warped. A vessel shimmered into existence, decloaking with a silent grace that bespoke a technology thousands of years beyond their own. It was a consortium shepherd ship, a sleek, organic-looking craft designed not for war, but for maintenance. A transmission opened, unencrypted, broadcast with an air of absolute authority. No face appeared on the screen, only a swirling, geometric pattern and a voice that was both melodic and utterly devoid of emotion, like a machine trying to replicate a lullaby. "This designation is Node 734, the voice stated. "Your presence is an anomaly. The sanitation of the Veil Nebula is proceeding on schedule. This celestial territory is being placed in permanent stasis for the stability of the Cygnus Arm. Your species' temporal signature will be neutralized in 3 standard cycles. There will be no further communication." The message ended. The shepherd ship, its duty performed, began to turn, its engines charging to slip back into the unseen. It didn't see them as a threat. It didn't see them as anything at all. It was a gardener pruning a weed, an exterminator clearing a pest. In that moment of cold, indifferent dismissal, something in Kalen Vance snapped. The fear, the dread, it all burned away, forged into a single, sharp point of pure defiance. He looked at Rostova, at Thorn, at his crew, their faces a mixture of terror and disbelief. "They think we're a bug to be squashed," he growled, his voice a low thunder in the silent cockpit. He slammed his hand down on the weapons console, activating the ship's single, overpowered, and highly illegal spinal railgun, a salvage from a long-dead warship. "Let's show them how this bug bites." Before Rostova could protest, and before reason could temper rebellion, he fired. A brilliant lance of incandescent plasma tore through the void and slammed into the shepherd ship's drive section. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was a crippling one. The ship shuddered, its graceful lines marred by a gaping, molten wound, its FTL drive shattering into a cloud of dead components. For the first time in a century, humanity had struck a blow against the consortium. The war for survival had begun, a war the enemy didn't even know it was fighting. The shepherd ship, disabled and exposed, now knew the anomaly was aware, and it was fighting back. The silence that followed the railgun's discharge was more profound than the void itself. On the bridge of the Ghost, every crew member was frozen, a tableau of shock mirroring the stasis field they had just witnessed. The brilliant plasma bolt, a searing line of pure defiance, had connected with the shepherd ship, and the result was a silent, beautiful catastrophe. The consortium vessel didn't explode in a conventional sense. Its advanced alloys and energy fields seemed to absorb and redirect the kinetic fury, but the damage was undeniable. A gaping, cherry-red wound festered on its flank where the FTL drive housing had been, and a cloud of crystalline components, a ghost of its former self, drifted away into the nebula. The shepherd shuddered, its graceful, organic flight faltering, and it began to list like a wounded leviathan. Kalen's knuckles were white where he gripped the console, the adrenaline of his impulsive act slowly giving way to the cold, crushing weight of what he had just done. "Kalen, what in the hell did you just do?" Rostova's voice was a low, dangerous hiss, cutting through the stunned silence. She wasn't shouting. It was worse. It was the controlled fury of a commander who had just seen the rule book not just thrown out, but incinerated. "I started a conversation," Kalen shot back, his eyes locked on the wounded ship. They weren't listening to words. Before the argument could escalate, the shepherd responded. It didn't fire back with weapons. Its reaction was something far more alien and unnerving. From the wound in its side, a swarm of small, silver spheres emerged, moving with a fluid. Insectoid purpose. They weren't attack drones, they were containment units. They're trying to patch the hole, Thorn murmured, his face pressed against the viewport, his initial terror replaced by a childlike, scientific wonder. But look, they're manipulating local space to do it, weaving it like thread. The spheres were emitting tiny, localized distortions, pulling the damaged edges of the hull back together, sealing the breach with shimmering fields of solidified space-time. The Shepherd wasn't just repairing itself, it was healing. "We can't let it finish," Rostova said, her mind snapping back into military focus. The shock was over. The tactical reality was setting in. That ship is a mobile factory for the stasis field. It contains all the data, all the schematics for the weapon they're using to erase us. We have one chance, right now, while it's crippled, to get inside and find a weakness. Kalen's instinct, the scavenger's instinct that had kept him alive for 2 decades in the Veil, screamed at him to run, to vanish back into the dust clouds and let the admirals in their safe asteroid fortress deal with the mess. But he looked at the cold, still line of the stasis field in the distance, a tombstone waiting for his species, and knew running was just a slower death. "Boarding that thing is suicide," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "It's not a ship. It's a clinic. We don't know what's inside." Rostova turned to him, her eyes burning with an intensity that matched his own defiance. "Then it's the kind of suicide we need right now. Your ship is the only one that can get us close without being torn apart by its automated defenses. You wanted a conversation. Captain, this is how you have it." The decision was made. Leaving his first mate, a grizzled veteran named Jax, in command of the Ghost, Kalen prepped for the boarding action alongside Rostova and a small, hand-picked team of her most trusted Marines. Thorn, refusing to be left behind, armed himself with a collection of scanners and diagnostic tools that looked more dangerous than any of the soldiers' pulse rifles. The plan was brutally simple. Use the Ghost's maneuverability to get them to the wound in the Shepherd's hull before the containment spheres could finish their work. The approach was a nightmare ballet. The Shepherd, while unable to flee, was not inert. Its point defense systems came online, but they weren't turrets firing projectiles. They were temporal emitters that created small, unpredictable pockets of accelerated or slowed time. Jax weaved the Ghost through the hazardous zones, the ship groaning as one wingtip grazed a dilation field, aging the metal by 100 years in a split second, causing it to flake and scar. Kalen, Rostova, and their team launched in a heavily armored boarding pod, a battered metal box designed for cracking open derelict freighters. They slammed into the molten edge of the Shepherd's wound, the pod's magnetic clamps biting into the strange, semi-organic hull. The moment the airlock hissed open, they knew they were in another reality. The inside of the consortium ship was stark, silent, and utterly non-human. There were no corridors, only vast, white chambers that seemed to shift their dimensions as you moved through them. The air was sterile, with a faint scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and cold. Gravity was a suggestion, not a law, shifting in intensity with each chamber they entered. Thorn was in a state of ecstatic terror, his scanners working furiously. "The architecture, it's quantum locked," he exclaimed, his voice crackling over the comms. "It reconfigures itself based on the observer's intent. Don't think about where you want to go. Think about where you need to go." It was a maddening, disorienting experience, but Rostova's iron discipline kept the team focused. She designated their objective the ship's control nexus, which Thorn theorized would be located at its center of energetic mass. Their progress was contested not by soldiers, but by the ship's immune system. Geometric constructs of hard light materialized from the walls, attempting to herd them into containment fields. Sections of the floor would suddenly become intangible, threatening to drop them into the humming energy conduits below. One Marine was lost when he was caught by a spatial warp. His body twisted and stretched into an impossible shape before vanishing with a silent implosion. It was a meat grinder, but one designed by a god of mathematics, not a god of war. Finally, they reached the heart of the vessel. It wasn't a bridge, but a colossal chamber where a sphere of pure, white light pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, like a captured star. Crystalline conduits fed into it from every direction, carrying streams of data that flowed like liquid light. This was the ship's mind, its central processor. "This is it," Thorn breathed, approaching the sphere with reverence. A sentient quantum core. Its thoughts are pure energy. As he began interfacing with it, using a device of his own invention to translate the core's light patterns into readable data, Rostova and Kalin stood guard, the surviving Marines forming a defensive perimeter. The information Thorn downloaded was a deluge, a torrent of alien science that made his brain ache. He saw the stasis field not as a weapon, but as a terraforming tool. The consortium wasn't destroying them. They were rezoning the galactic neighborhood, preparing the Veil for some future purpose by rendering it inert. To them, humanity's existence was as significant as a termite infestation in a house slated for demolition. But within the data, Thorn found what they were looking for: a weakness. The stasis field was not a self-contained wall. It was projected from a network of massive emitters, all synchronized and controlled by a single gargantuan command hub. A celestial machine Thorn's frantic translations dubbed the Conductor. The Conductor was the heart of the entire operation, nestled in a pocket of warped space deep within the Veil. If they could destroy it, the field would collapse. They had their answer, but the ship knew what they had done. The moment the critical data was copied, the white light of the core turned a furious, blood red. A new voice, the same calm, melodic voice from the broadcast, but now edged with something cold and analytical, filled the chamber. "Anomaly has been analyzed. Threat level reclassified. Contagion protocol initiated." The entire ship shuddered violently. The walls began to dissolve, not into rubble, but into shimmering curtains of pure energy. "It's erasing itself," Thorn yelled, frantically securing the data slate in his pack. "And it's going to take us with it." The escape was a chaotic, desperate scramble back through the disintegrating ship. Chambers collapsed behind them, not in explosions, but in neat, silent deletions from reality. They were running a race against oblivion itself. They made it back to the boarding pod with seconds to spare, launching from the hull just as the last of the shepherd ship folded in on itself, collapsing into a single, infinitesimal point of light before vanishing completely. It hadn't been destroyed. It had been unwritten. Back on the bridge of the battered Ghost, silence reigned once more. They were alive. They had the data. They had a target. But as Kalin looked at the empty space where the shepherd had been, he knew the truth. That ship had sent a final report. The gardener now knew the weeds could think, could fight, could wound. The quiet, indifferent sanitation was over. Humanity was no longer an oversight to be corrected. They were now a contagion to be purged. And the full, undivided attention of the consortium was about to turn upon them. The ghost limped back to Bastion, a wounded messenger carrying the gospel of a coming apocalypse. The data slate, cradled by Thorn as if it were a holy relic, contained both their salvation and their death warrant. The conductor was the target, the single point of failure in the consortium's grand design of cosmic erasure. But the slate also held the Shepherd ship's final, chilling report. It detailed humanity's tactics, our technology, our aggression, all analyzed with a cold, terrifying objectivity. The report didn't label them as enemies. It reclassified them as a sentient viral outbreak. The war for survival had become a war against a pestle, and humanity was the plague. When Kalen and Rostova presented their findings to the Terran Defense Fleet Command, the bureaucratic ice finally shattered. The admirals, faced with undeniable proof, the ghost's battle-scarred hull, the testimony of a shaken but resolute sub-commander, and Thorn's terrifyingly lucid data were forced to confront the abyss. The apathetic skepticism was replaced by a palpable, chilling fear. Bastion, the heart of human civilization, transformed overnight. The hum of civilian life was drowned out by the clang of military mobilization. Production lines that once built trade vessels were retooled to churn out warships, and every able-bodied citizen was conscripted into the frantic, last-ditch effort to build a fleet capable of fighting a ghost. But the true battlefield, for now, was the war room where Kalen, Rostova, and Thorn found themselves at the center of humanity's desperate strategic planning. The Admiralty, trained for conventional warfare, was at a loss. How do you fight an enemy who can unmake reality? How do you plan an attack against a target hidden in a fold of space-time? Kalen, the scavenger who knew the Veil's every secret passage and gravitational current, became an unlikely strategic advisor. He pointed to Thorn's celestial maps, charting a course to the conductor that was not a straight line, but a treacherous, winding path through black holes and radiation storms, a route no sane military commander would ever consider, but one that might just keep the fleet hidden from the consortium's omniscient gaze. They see everything in normal space, Kalen argued, his voice cutting through the Admiral's hesitant murmurs. They expect us to come at them head on. We have to use the Veil itself as our shield. Move through the chaos they think is impassable. Rostova, her tactical acumen sharpened by their horrific boarding action, became the architect of the fleet's new doctrine. We can't match their technology, she stated, her voice echoing in the hushed command center. Every shepherd we face will adapt. We'll learn. Our only advantage is our unpredictability, our recklessness. She proposed a strategy based on decentralized command, on wolf packs of smaller, faster ships that could strike and fade, harassing the consortium's operations and sowing chaos. They would not fight a war of attrition, which they would lose in minutes, but a war of 1,000 cuts, designed to distract and disorient the enemy long enough for a single desperate strike against the conductor. While the admirals and engineers struggled to turn these radical theories into a viable war plan, Thorn was locked in the battle of his own. The consortium's data was a poison chalice. The more he studied it, the more he understood their technology, the more his own mind began to buckle under the sheer weight of its alien logic. He worked feverishly, trying to reverse engineer their temporal mechanics, to find a chink in the armor of their space-time manipulation. His lab became a nest of humming capacitors and sparking prototypes as he sought to build not a bigger gun, but a weapon that could disrupt the fundamental constants of physics, a chronoton lance that could, in theory, create a resonance cascade within the conductor's power source. He grew gaunt. his eyes sinking deeper into his skull, haunted by visions of a universe governed by equations he could barely comprehend. Meanwhile, the consortium's response was not one of overt aggression. It was more insidious. The stasis field's advance didn't accelerate. It simply continued its steady, inexorable creep. A new phenomena began to occur along its border. Consortium shaper ships that manipulated reality on a granular level began to appear, reinforcing the field. They weren't just freezing space, they were reinforcing its boundaries, making it impenetrable. They were turning the veil from a cage into a tomb. Scouts reported strange temporal anomalies deep within human territory loops of time that trap patrol ships for eternity. Pockets of reversed entropy, where wounds would uninflict themselves and fuel tanks would mysteriously refill, luring pilots into a false sense of security before the trap snapped shut. The consortium was experimenting, dissecting humanity's reactions with the detached curiosity of a biologist studying a specimen in a petri dish. They weren't fighting a war, they were conducting a study, and every human casualty was another data point. The weight of this cold, psychological warfare began to take its toll on Bastion's population. Hope, which had initially flared with the promise of a fight, began to curdle into a quiet, simmering dread. The construction of the war fleet became less a symbol of defiance and more a testament to their desperation. It was against this backdrop of grinding fear that the first major engagement occurred. Rostova, now promoted to full commander, led a small task force on a probing mission, testing her Wolfpack tactics. They targeted a cluster of shaper ships reinforcing a section of the stasis field boundary. The battle was a blur of hit-and-run attacks. Human ships, small corvettes, and heavy fighters warped in. Bis unleashed a full volley of torpedoes and plasma cannons, and then vanished back into the Veil's dense clouds before the Shapers could lock onto them. For a moment, it seemed to be working. 2 Shaper ships were damaged, their reality-bending fields flickering, but then the consortium adapted. A colossal shepherd ship emerged from a fold in space directly in the center of Rostova's formation. It didn't fire a single weapon. Instead, it pulsed, emitting a wave of pure chronological energy. On the bridge of her command corvette, the Stiletto, Rostova watched in horror as her fleet was caught in the wave. One of her ships instantly aged 1,000 years, its hull corroding to dust in a heartbeat. Another was de-aged, its systems reverting to their raw, unmanufactured components, its crew ceasing to exist as they were unborn from time. The Stiletto itself was caught on the edge of the field. Rostova saw her reflection in a console screen momentarily split into an infant, a young cadet, and a wizened old woman, all existing in the same terrible moment. Her pilot, a young man named Ren, screamed as his hands fused with the controls, the ship's systems and his own biology momentarily becoming one. They escaped, but at a terrible cost. Over half of her task force was lost, not destroyed, but simply unmade. Rostova returned to Bastion a different woman. The fire in her eyes was now banked with a cold, hard horror. She had seen the true face of the enemy, and it was a face of absolute, indifferent power. In the war room, her report cast a pall of despair. The Wolfpack tactic, their one hope of a strategic advantage, had been rendered obsolete in its first real test. "They don't have to beat us," she said, her voice hollow. "They just have to edit us out." Kalen watched her, his heart aching for the young, ambitious officer he had met just weeks ago, now a haunted veteran of a war that defied all known rules. He looked at Thorne, who was muttering to himself, staring at a half-finished equation on his screen. lost on the edge of a breakthrough or madness. He looked at the admirals, their faces grim, their plans in tatters. He knew then that ships and tactics wouldn't be enough. The consortium saw them as a virus that thought, that fought, that defied the natural order. To win this war, humanity had to become something the consortium could never predict, something that defied even their godlike understanding of the universe. They had to become an idea, a principle of chaos injected into a system of perfect, suffocating order. And as the captain of the Ghost, a man who had made a life out of being an anomaly, Kalen Vance knew, with chilling certainty, that the burden of becoming that chaos would fall on him. The defeat of Rostova's task force plunged Bastion into a deep, cold funk. The frantic energy of mobilization slowed, replaced by the grim, quiet efficiency of a civilization preparing for its own funeral. The fleet was still being built, but the clanging of hammers in the shipyard sounded less like a battle cry and more like the nailing of a coffin. In the command center, the strategic map was a sea of red alerts and encroaching doom. The stasis field advanced, and with it came the Shapers, not just reinforcing the border, but actively reshaping captured territory, smoothing the chaotic nebula into a placid, uniform canvas of inert space. It was a slow, meticulous genocide, and humanity was powerless to stop it. It was Kalen who broke the paralysis. He stormed into a high-level strategy meeting, a ghost in his worn scavenger's jacket amidst a sea of polished uniforms, and threw a new plan onto the holographic table. It was not a battle plan. It was a heist. "We can't destroy the conductor with our fleet," he said, his voice raw with an energy that had been absent from the station for weeks. "Every direct approach is a death sentence. But the consortium has a blind spot. Their system is perfect, logical, and completely centralized. They don't account for individual, suicidal stupidity." His plan was as insane as it was simple. A single ship, small, fast, and packed to the gills with experimental technology, would make a run for the conductor. Not the whole fleet, not a task force, but one vessel. The shepherd ships, the Shapers. They're the antibodies of the system, he explained, pointing at Thorn, who stood beside him, looking more like a prophet of doom than a scientist. They're programmed to respond to military threats, to fleet-scale energy signatures. But one ship, flying a ghost profile through the gravitational shadows, I know. It might be dismissed as debris, a sensor ghost. It might just get close enough. The ship would not carry conventional weapons. Its entire purpose would be to deliver a single payload, Thorn's Chronoton Lance, a device that was still volatile, theoretical, and more likely to erase its own ship from time than it was to damage the target. The admiral stared in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process a strategy that hinged on a single's desperate, near impossible gambit. But it was Rostova who finally spoke, her voice clear and steady for the first time since her defeat. "He's right," she said, her eyes meeting Kalen's. "Our fleet has another purpose now. It can't be the sword. It has to be the shield." The new, revised Operation Final Stand was born. The bulk of humanity's fleet, everything they had built, would launch a massive, coordinated, and ultimately suicidal assault on a dozen different points along the stasis field border. It would be a grand, desperate gesture of defiance designed to do one thing: get the consortium's full and undivided attention. They would be the distraction, the glorious, burning sacrifice that would, with luck, create the opening Kalen needed. As the fleet prepared for its final battle, the Ghost was transformed. Shipwrights and engineers swarmed over it, stripping it of every non-essential component the crew quarters, the galley, even the scavenged railgun that had started the war. They replaced the weight with extra shielding, experimental sensor baffles, and at its heart, cradled in a nest of humming, sparking machinery, Thorn's chronoton lance. The device looked like a piece of abstract art, a sculpture of intersecting crystalline rods and humming conduits that pulsed with a dangerous, unstable light. Thorn himself would have to go with it, as only he could perform the final, impossibly complex calibrations in the moments before firing. Kalen found Rostova on an observation deck overlooking the main shipyard, watching as the final warships were christened with hurried, somber ceremonies. The fire was back in her eyes, but it was a different kind of fire now, not the blaze of ambition, but the steady, hot glow of acceptance. "It's a beautiful, pointless gesture, isn't it?" she said, her voice quiet. "We're throwing everything we are against a wall that doesn't even know we're hitting it." "It's not pointless if it works," Kalen replied. "My crew is staying," he added, a knot tightening in his chest. "Jax will take them on a freighter, run for the dark sectors beyond the veil. There's a chance, a small one, that they can get out before the field closes completely." Rostova turned to him, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "I ordered the last of the civilian transports to do the same. Sent my family on the first one." For a moment, they weren't a scavenger and a commander. They were just two people standing on the precipice of oblivion, their duty a shared, crushing weight. The day came. As the fleet began to muster, a silent, grim armada against a backdrop of swirling starlight, Kalen, Thorn, and a skeleton crew of volunteer pilots and engineers boarded the modified Ghost. Its new designation was the Hope's Folly, a name that perfectly captured the spirit of their mission. Rostova was to command the battle from Bastion's war room, orchestrating the grand sacrifice. Just before they sealed the airlock, she handed Kalen a small data chip. "This contains the fleet's full battle telemetry," she said. "If you make it, make sure someone remembers what we did here. Make sure they know we didn't just lie down and die." Kalen took the chip, their fingers brushing for a brief second. It was a moment of profound, unspoken understanding. Then the hatches sealed, and the Hope's Folly detached from its mooring, a tiny sliver of metal against the vastness of the station. The fleet jumped. 100 warships, the sum total of humanity's defiance, warped into the no-man's land bordering the stasis field, and the consortium noticed. Shepherd ships materialized by the score, their elegant forms moving to intercept the infection. Shapers began to warp the battlefield, creating gravitational traps and temporal bubbles. The human fleet, commanded from afar by Rostova, charged into the maelstrom. It was a slaughter, but a magnificent one. Ships exploded in silent flashes of light, their crews erased from existence by temporal waves. But they took their toll, using Rostova's original Wolfpack tactics on a massive scale. They swarmed individual shepherds, overwhelming their defenses with sheer, brute force. They inflicted wounds. They drew the system's attention. They screamed their existence into the void. Amidst the chaos, the Hope's Folly slipped away. Kalen pushed the ship to its absolute limits, flying a suicidal course through a cluster of micro-singularities that shielded them from the main battle. On the bridge, Thorn was a man possessed, his hands flying over the Lance's control panel, his eyes glowing with reflected light as he monitored the energy flowing into its core. They navigated by instinct and Thorn's impossible physics, surfing on gravitational waves, diving through pockets of warped space that would have torn a normal ship apart. They were a needle slipping through the cracks of reality. The closer they got to the conductor's hidden coordinates, The stranger space became time ebbed and flowed around the hull, and the crew saw ghostly after images of themselves, echoes of futures that might never be. Finally, they arrived. The conductor was not a space station or a machine in any recognizable sense. It was a star, a captive sun, encased in a colossal, kilometers-wide framework of crystalline energy conduits and temporal stabilizers. It was a celestial engine of terrifying scale and beauty, pulsing with the power that was freezing the galaxy. It was also unguarded. The consortium's entire immune system was miles away, distracted by the fleet's magnificent, dying screams. "This is it," Kalen breathed, his hand steady on the helm. "Thorn, are you ready?" Thorn didn't answer. He was swaying, his face pale, a trickle of blood leaking from his nose. The sheer proximity to the conductor's temporal emissions was overloading his mind. "The equation. It's beautiful," he whispered, his fingers hovering over the final activation sequence. "Iris now," Kalen yelled, as proximity alarms began to scream. The conductor had finally registered their presence. From the surface of the crystalline cage, tendrils of energy began to lash out, probing, analyzing. Thorn snapped back to reality. With a final, agonized cry, a sound of both triumph and despair, he slammed his hand down on the activation panel. The chronoton lance fired. It did not emit a beam of light or a bolt of plasma. It unleashed a wave of pure, conceptual noise, a deafening blast of temporal paradox that ripped through space-time itself. The wave struck the conductor, and for a single, infinite moment, everything went white. The white was not an absence of color, but an overabundance of it, a convergence of every photon that had ever been or ever would be, focused into a single, intolerable point. On the bridge of the Hope's Folly, the universe stopped being a sequence of events and became a single, infinitely dense moment of pure existence. The experience was not survivable. It was something to be endured. Kalen felt the welding sparks that had fused his ship's hull in a forgotten asteroid dock and the final, frigid entropy of its heat death simultaneously. He felt the phantom pain of wounds he would receive in futures that now would never happen, and tasted the air of planets his ancestors had yet to evolve on. His own consciousness, his sense of self, was a fragile raft on a sea of infinity, and the temporal waves were threatening to splinter it into a million pieces. The ship's alarms were no longer sounds but events. A klaxon from the previous Tuesday blared a warning about a hull breach that would occur next Thursday. A piercing shriek from 3 seconds in the future warned of the structural failure that was happening right now. It was an orchestra of disaster playing in a key of pure madness. At the epicenter of this ontological hurricane, Eris Thorn was no longer a man but a conduit, a living bridge between the rigid, crystalline logic of the consortium and the messy, irrational chaos of humanity. The raw data of the universe poured through him, and his mind, far from breaking, was expanding to contain it. He saw the elegant, perfect equation that governed the stasis field, the axiom upon which the consortium's reality was built. It was a truth as fundamental as gravity, as absolute as the speed of light. And into this perfect truth, he had introduced a lie, the human variable. He had shown the equation that 1 + 1 could sometimes equal a desperate hope, a suicidal charge, an irrational love. He had taught it paradox. He turned to Kalen, his physical form now little more than a translucent film of light, his eyes containing the birth and death of stars. His voice was 1,000 whispers from 1,000 timelines. "It's not a machine," the chorus echoed. a sound that felt more like a memory than a vibration in the air. It's an axiom, a single, foundational truth, and we just taught it how to lie. A final ecstatic smile bloomed on his dissolving face, an expression of ultimate discovery and terrifying apotheosis. A paradox is a story with no end, a beautiful, perfect lie. Then, with a gentle, final sigh that was felt more than heard, he poured the last of his being into the temporal wave, his consciousness becoming the ghost in the machine, the central flaw in the perfect thought. His sacrifice was the final piece of the equation, the human element that made the beautiful math go monstrously, wonderfully wrong. As Thorne's essence fused with the conductor, the paradox took root. The lance's wave did not dissipate. It resonated, amplified by the celestial engine it was designed to destroy. The captive star at the conductor's heart, a sun tamed by perfect logic, now pulsed with the rhythm of an insane drumbeat. It spewed flares of temporal radiation, raw causality untethered from effect. One of these flares struck the Hope's Folly. The ship's starboard engine was flung into a self-contained time loop, forever exploding and reforming in a silent, violent cycle that lasted less than a microsecond. The hull plating near the cockpit began to live its entire lifespan at once, shimmering with the gleam of newness, the scars of forgotten battles, and the pockmarked decay of 1 billion years of exposure, all shifting and bleeding into one another. Kalen, slammed against his command chair by a gravitational shear, gripped the controls with a primal stubbornness. He was no longer flying a ship. He was wrestling with a localized and hostile reality. He poured every ounce of his will into a single, simple concept forward. He ignored the ghostly after-images of his crew flickering in and out of existence. He ignored the star charts that now displayed constellations that wouldn't exist for millennia. He focused on a single point in the swirling chaos ahead and willed his fractured vessel to move toward it. He was a scavenger, a creature of the void's forgotten edges. He had always been an anomaly, and in this sea of uncreation, his own defiant, illogical existence was the only anchor he had left. On Bastion, the last rites of the human race were being observed in the sterile silence of the command center. Each of the 312 icons that had represented humanity's final, defiant roar had gone dark, one by one. Rostova had watched every last one of them extinguish. She had heard the final Bial, garbled transmission of a young captain screaming his defiance as his corvette was aged into dust. She had seen the life signs of an entire carrier group vanish as they were de-aged out of existence. Her face was a mask of granite, but her heart was a graveyard. The distraction had been perfect. The cost was everything. Then the impossible happened. The icon for the conductor didn't explode or go offline. The quadrant of space it occupied on the map became a tear, a wound of pure static that bled across the display. A split second later, the system buckled. A wave of incoherent, paradoxical data surged through every sensor system on Bastion. Consoles erupted in geysers of sparks, and the grand holographic map, the symbol of their ordered, military world, shattered into a slow-motion cascade of 1 million glittering, useless fragments. Status! Rostova's voice cut through the chaos, devoid of shock, filled only with the demand for a truth she could no longer see. Commander, the field. An analyst stammered, his face ashen in the glow of a malfunctioning emergency monitor. The boundary integrity is 0. It's not collapsing. It's curdling. The death of the stasis field was the universe's scream of protest against the paradox now eating at its heart. The clean, hard edge of frozen space-time did not recede. It shattered into an infinite fractal web of temporal fissures. The entire veil was coming apart at the seams of reality. The remaining ships of the human fleet, wounded, bleeding, and preparing for their own annihilation, suddenly found themselves floating in a new, insane cosmos. One pilot transmitted a hysterical, laughing report of watching a consortium shepherd, the perfect predator, get snagged by a temporal fissure and pulled apart into an endless, looping ribbon of itself, its silent scream echoing across eternity. Another watched a dead star, frozen for eons within the field, spontaneously reignite in a reverse supernova, inhaling light and spewing waves of anti-causality that unwrote two of its own escort drones from ever having been built. At the sight of this fundamental violation, the consortium's response was immediate, unified, and utterly chilling. They stopped fighting. In perfect silent unison, every shepherd and shaper disengaged. There was no communication, no retreat into hyperspace. They simply ceased to interact with the battlefield. They turned inward toward some unseen rallying point in their own corrupted network, and with a cold, precise grace, they folded space around themselves and were gone. It was not the withdrawal of a beaten army. It was the clinical and meticulous action of a researcher realizing their entire experiment has become contaminated, has mutated into something so unpredictable and alien that the only logical response is to cauterize the wound, abandon the lab, and seal the door forever. They were not fleeing humanity. They were quarantining them. In the aftermath, a new age was born. The shattered veil was a place of terrible beauty and impossible wonders, a frontier where the scars of the temporal war had become the geography. There were rivers of condensed time where prospectors could age raw ore into refined metal in hours. There were vast, silent voids of reverse entropy where the wreckage of Rostova's lost fleet would slowly, ghost-like, reassemble themselves. It was a universe with no solid rules, a perfect home for the species that had broken them. Rostova, the reluctant chancellor of this new, chaotic era, stood on the observation deck of a bastion that was now the capital of a territory defined by its lawlessness. Humanity was wounded, reduced to a shadow of its former self, but it was ferociously, defiantly alive. The data chip Kalen had given her was now the heart of a memorial, the only record of the fleet that had burned itself to ash to light a single, desperate path. The Hope's Folly and its captain were lost, consumed by the reality storm they had unleashed. Kalen Vance became a myth, a necessary legend for a species that now lived among ghosts. In the makeshift bars of asteroid outposts and on the bridges of scavenger ships braving the new frontier, they told stories of a patchwork freighter that could be glimpsed sometimes out on the temporal tides, not as wreckage, but as a master of the current, its hull scarred with impossible futures, forever navigating the beautiful, insane universe it had helped to create. Humanity had faced the perfect, silent order of the void, and they had answered it with a roar so full of chaotic, stubborn, and beautifully flawed life that it had shattered reality itself. They hadn't won their place in the galaxy. They had made the galaxy remake itself around them.